Hi, I'm Stephen Galloway, and welcome to Close Up with the Hollywood Reporter writers. I'd like to welcome Lorene Scafaria, Taika Waititi, Casey Lemmons, Destin Cretton, Charles Randolph, and Anthony McCarten. Welcome. I want to plunge you in the deep end and start with Martin Scorsese said some of the movies now being made, particularly the superhero movies, are theme park rides, they're not cinema. Agree or disagree?
Agree. He's absolutely right. And I've always said this. Disagree. Yeah. I know how much work goes into the story, breaking stories, and for those films, and how much work goes into to shooting and the post-production, and it's all based on story for that studio. And at the end of the day, it's whatever's in that rectangle, and if it's affecting people emotionally, or it doesn't matter if it's too colourful. Maybe it's just too colourful for him. But yeah, well, the costumes might not look Italian enough. I don't know. It does feel about that.
I can only imagine he's actually worried about the dominance of that particular type of film, and there is an exaggerated proportion of that type of film dominating the multiplexes, and that's just a result of the economics of it. They're just making a lot of money, and the audiences seem to be bottomless for these movies. And while the audience remains for these movies, they will continue to be dominant until something else is put out there. Bohemian Rhapsody was a movie I was involved with. That's people didn't expect that kind of Marvel-level box office as a result of that. But the good news is that now that's made a case for itself. And I can see that there's going to be a bit of a deluge of that type of movie. So I think the challenge, it starts with us in a way, is that we need to come up with stories that make a case, an economic case, to say there's a massive audience for this, and then the people who run the multiplexes, the distributors, will be only too happy to put them on.
Bohemian Rhapsody was an exception. I mean, you've done Theory of Everything, you've done Darkest Hour, which were hits, but they weren't $700 or $800 million hits. So how do you create character-driven films that reach a big audience? Can you?
I think so. I think it's often a combination of the actor and the character that bring excitement to an audience. So that's what I think Iron Man did. It was Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, and I think that was the perfect blend of star power and a character. And so I think that's what people might turn out for more now. Is that?
Comic books and graphic novels, were always kind of laughed at, and in the past as not being real art or not being real stories, and it's just simply not true. And that, and with superheroes, it's just new mythology. So it's, I'm sure that when people came up with stories about about Zeus or about different gods or Hercules, thousands of years ago, people were like, "Oh, this is not real. This is not a real story. This is bullshit. This guy did all this stuff." But it's actually just taking those similar things, and and eventually Iron Man will enter into the I think the realm of mythology, and people will say, "Oh, and it's just stories." It's just all of it at the end of the day for me is stories that are either teaching you lessons or or helping us experience the human condition in different ways.
Its critique is really about originality, right? At the end of the day, and once you have a dedicated group of shared experience amongst these audiences, you can start to play with that. And maybe we're not there yet. I mean, he's right to the degree that a lot of it is not very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in the aggregate, perhaps, if you were to do the math, it's in his favor. But
are you finding it harder to get more character-driven, difficult films like Just Mercy off the ground?
I feel like we really lucked out with where Just Mercy landed. We had executives at Warner Brothers who were huge champions of telling the story from a character's POV that you typically don't see on screen very much. And they honestly have treated it like they treat their superhero movies. When we were sitting in our marketing meeting, it was a huge meeting. It was a big campaign of really excited people because to them right now it actually is something different for the studio to do. So, you know, it's inspiring to see that much passion for a movie like this.
Mm-hmm. Are there any subjects that you as writers would not touch?
As opposed to, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago? Yeah, for sure.
What?
You know, the model of appropriation for a screenwriter is complicated, right? Because on one hand, you want to have a rich variety of characters in your films. On the other hand, if you're wholly embodying a subject that is alien to your culture and you feel like there are other people who can do it better than you can, there are things that I would not do today that I would have done 10 years ago.
Give us an example.
There's an adaptation of a book about 3 African-American kids in New York who kidnap a white state attorney that I wrote about a decade ago. It's one of my favorite scripts. It will never get made, probably shouldn't get made, because it is just not, it relies too much on me being in a world that I don't fully understand, I think, at the end of the day, and no amount of research would probably get me there.
One thing that we have to understand is that the language of the dominant culture is one that we all speak. Yeah. But there are specific cultures that you have to be versed in those languages. Yeah. So you have to do the work to figure out what that is, and that takes. I mean, I've seen very good work outside of culture. Obviously, I think if the empathy is there and the investigation, and it's done sincerely, and you have to have the depth of really understanding, and that means digging into the research. Of course, but you have to really go the whole distance. You can't toe dip. So that's, I think when you toe dip, I can feel it. And when there's deep investigation, deep empathy, and really digging into the story and the characters, then no, it's just a really good movie.
But we are in a particular era where there's great sensitivity to that. Is there, by contrast, a film that you would have loved to write that somebody hasn't let you do because they feel you're not right for it?
Well, I'm on the threshold of doing something which is can be accused or may be accused of appropriation, which is writing a black female character. And
real life or not?
Real life, yeah.
Who is the character?
I'd rather not say, but...
Who is the character?
Well, you're free to ask. And freedom is the operative word here. I think fiction means freedom. And I think we have to fight for that. And so God bless you for standing up for the fact that writers must be free to travel. We have to have passports into every territory. If we had ever pigeonholed ourselves and saying, I can only write about being a middle-aged white man. We're all doomed. Shakespeare would never have written about anything outside of England. We would have never had Merchant of Venice. He's not a merchant, never went to Venice. So we have to fight for it, and against some strong headwinds, because there is opposition to writers who chance their arm, imaginatively journey into a world they don't know, but want to know, and are knocked back by people who are saying, you're not of that culture, get back in your box. And I think we really have to fight,
But don't you agree? You can't quite be like just a tourist, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You have to really do some immersive work.
I can wholeheartedly agree with you. Yeah, you can't flippantly go in and do something. You have to do deep research and get it right. But isn't that true for every character you do?
It is, but I mean, some are more challenging than others. I mean, I try and really do that investigative work. But I mean, I do think that so much great work has been written by so many people. I mean, as a writer, you should be able to explore humanity, and
borderless. Yeah.
But when you do, I want to go back to what you said, which is, fiction is freedom. What are the limits of freedom? Everybody on this table has written a script involving real people. What are your responsibilities to the truth? Taika, how much is it okay to fictionalize Hitler?
That version of Hitler that I wrote shares nothing with the real guy other than that moustache, really. He is conjured from the mind of a 10-year-old, so you can only know what a 10-year-old knows. And so there's and I had no real interest in writing an authentic portrayal, or when I played him, had no interest in actually putting in the effort or putting in the research, because I just didn't think he deserved it. And I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of me actually having to read about him and study his nuances and his mannerisms. It's screw this guy, I'm not going to do that.
Can we put your feet to the fire a little bit on that one? Because it is Hitler. I mean, we identify him as Hitler. And would you not agree that a lot of the jokes and power of the jokes derive from the fact that this voice in the air of this boy is Hitler? And a lot of the humour comes from the fact of the ultimate fascist.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's only one moment when I used one of his speeches from one of his rallies, and it's a moment when he gets very serious, and it's really Jojo's conscience kind of trying, the sort of dark side of his conscience, trying desperately to hold on to him. And everything else, I tried to write him as, there's versions of myself in there, and how I used to think when I was a kid, and how children perceive the world. All of that kind of is filtered through that character, and he is just essentially, yes, it's funny because it's like it's those ideas and those things being said coming out of the mouth of this, this tyrant. But aren't you worried that in truly fictionalizing him and turning him into a buffoon, you may be diminishing the threat? Not worried at all.
But that's what satire does. You invert. Yeah. So you make someone who's unserious serious, you make the serious unserious. And that's how you skewer power. That's the nature of satire.
I think there's also something else, because it's the point of view of a child. You're saying, I mean, what's scary to me is that a child's view is cartoonish, you know what I mean? And there's this cartoon kind of character friend that's this extremely dangerous person, but, in the mind of this child, and it really makes you understand indoctrination of children in a way, and I appreciate it on that level.
How much did you feel that you had to stick to the real characters in Hustlers?
I didn't get a chance to meet the real women ahead of time, which was really hard for me, because creatively I would have loved to have heard every detail. I think the truth is stranger than fiction, but I had the article to work from, and so I felt a responsibility to what really happened and the crimes themselves. I didn't want to water them down, but I felt a little bit of freedom when it came to the characters, because we're trying to just tell a story, tell the movie version of it. So the two characters they form a friendship, and it's kind of a love story between the two of them, and in reality they were more like business partners. So I had to add a lot to the characters and the relationship.
Did you go into strip clubs and do research?
Sure, yeah.
And what surprised you about that world?
There's no job security for these women. They're not employees of these clubs. They pay house fees. They tip everybody out. So the difference between a good night and a bad night is a lot. It's how much you go home with. It's not necessarily did you have a great interaction with someone or a bad interaction. I mean, certainly there's a lot to deal with in that way, but they work in pairs and teams. It's much more lucrative.
Did you like them?
Yeah, I did like them, and I heard so many different experiences. I think that's the beautiful part of it, is that you can talk to so many different women who are having the time of their lives. This job provides incredible freedom. They work for a month, they go take their band on the road, and other girls who, escaped a bad relationship. And, for some people it's transitional, and for other people it's where they are. And so it was incredibly enlightening to speak to them.
I love the class elements and your ability to capture so many of those things. Was that a matter of hanging out with them, or had you had some interaction with people from that part of the boroughs in Long Island before? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, so I felt like I grew up with these guys, I grew up with these girls. I worked in a boiler room when I was 18, just like doing secretarial work, but it was really just a off Wall Street, northern New Jersey, a room full of phones that guys are selling bad stocks to old people. And my mom worked there for a time. A guy said he was going to hit her in the head with a baseball bat. And the bosses said, bottom line, can you keep working with him? Because he's bringing in the money and you're just typing stuff into a computer. So, yeah, it was remarkable. But there was another guy who was on a headset for 6 months talking to nobody. He was losing his mind.
Oh, wow.
So it was really like...
I want to see that. I can identify.
Exactly.
What's the worst jobs you've all had to do along the way? Because most writers don't really make it till they're, it's certainly in their 30s. Have you all done tough jobs?
So many jobs.
What?
Yeah.
I, in Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, worked in the Pepsi plant, shoveling saccharin into the syrup formula. Ooh. And even 3 weeks after I quit that job, I could pull a piece of
luxury.
hair.
Did you ever drink Pepsi?
Yeah, so sugaring the Pepsi. I worked on the night sort at UPS, which is a job where you put the packages in the trucks in order so the drivers can do that from 1 to 6 in the morning. It's you lose a little bit of weight because you're running for 5 hours. So I've had
Who else?
I worked in a coal yard, bagging coal, 80-kilogram bags, and then getting them into trucks and stuff. Dirty job.
Sheesh.
It was all right.
Can't really beat that.
How about you?
I shot wedding videos. That's how I paid the bills for a long time.
Pretty clean cut.
Oh, I don't know. That sounds...
It was actually
Did anybody ever fire you from a wedding?
No, it was one of the most rewarding creative jobs I've ever had. I also worked at a group home for teenagers, which at the time I didn't realize was going to be the inspiration for my first feature, but I worked there as a counselor for 2 years.
Was that difficult?
It was extremely difficult, yeah. I didn't realize how sheltered I was as a child growing up in Hawaii until I took that gig. It was very eye-opening to kind of the ugliness in the world, but simultaneously it also opened my eyes to the beauty of humans and their ability to find life and laughter in the darkest places.
In what way did it open your eyes to the ugliness? What particularly?
I mean, you look at you're on a floor with 20 kids, and every single one of them are struggling because of the effects of some type of abuse or neglect from parents or a lack of parents, and it was very, very eye-opening for dealing with that every single day.
What about you, Casey?
I would have to go with naked life modeling.
That's my one.
Winner. Yeah.
Two Popes. How much was fictionalized, and how much do you feel you were justified if you did fictionalize it?
So it's a really tough, complex question, because you get to the heart of how much license should you permit yourself when you're doing anything based on a real story. And I've taken various takes on this over the last few years. I've done cradle to grave stuff, which is very, very, very faithful to historical fact. And in this case, it's probably the most adventurous use of artistic license that I've had. But I would still put my hand into that fire and say that this is more than perhaps any of the others in the service of the truth, and that it's not necessarily literally true that they had these conversations. We don't know what they said to each other. I know they met 3 times. And
they only met 3 times?
They've only met 3 times.
That's extraordinary for 2 popes.
Yeah. It's imaginatively speculating on what transpires between 2 people. We have known details, but in between those gaps, we have to infuse with our own. We surmise, we try and be as emotionally authentic as we can within the parameters of the people we're dealing with. At its heart, The Two Popes is a story of a progressive and a conservative. And I hope it speaks to the broader conversation in society at the moment, where we have these 2 camps. We're not quite sure which will ensure our futures better than the other. And there's so much anger passing back and forth that they're being polarized and driven further apart. The middle seems to have collapsed. To paraphrase Yeats, the center is not held. And this project was about trying to get these 2 positions into dialogue with each other in a debate. And they're highly combative at the beginning, but they find peace with each other. And it's embedded in the truth. There's a lot of research that went into what their stated positions were. My area of confection, if you like, was that I put those 2 positions into dialogue with each other and built a dialectic around that.
It's such an interesting phrase, in the service of the truth, you know.
Yeah.
When you're doing historical representation, you know, something that is fiction and yet historical, you have to invent conversations. Yeah. You know these 2 people are friends. You know, like we know Harriet Tubman went to this place and met with these people. But I came to feel that I was in conversation with her. So the questions that I had to ask, I asked in writing the script and in doing the movie. When I had a question, I would ask it. And I believed that I had the answer.
What do you mean you would ask it?
I would ask her directly, Harriet, how do you feel about this? Are we cool? Am I going too far? Or did this happen? How did it happen? And I would wait until I felt that I was getting the answer. I have one question, which is, she's quoted as her last line being, I go to prepare a place for you. And I thought that that is one of the most beautiful, I just wonder, that was the one I didn't quite have the answer. Did you actually say that? Were those actually your last words? I go to prepare a place for you? I mean, my God, woman. That's beautiful. And I did 7 months of pure research on Harriet and the Underground Railroad. But, in even the best scholarly books, you'll have something that'll say, she made her way to Philadelphia. It's like, okay. That's helpful. So you have to build things out and build things in. And to make it dramatic, of course, but also in the service of the truth, which is, I know she had this position, I know this person was her friend, I know he worried about her, William still, because I can tell that from letters, but I don't know what their conversations were.
You've been knocked a bit for not casting an African-American woman in the lead, which is played by Cynthia Erivo, and very beautifully. How do you feel about that? And did you think about it when you cast the part?
She was on the movie before me.
Oh.
I didn't know that there would be, conversation about it. About Cynthia, you just don't get any better. She was prepared in every way you could possibly be prepared to play this role. She was prepared physically, emotionally, spiritually to play Harriet Tubman, and she was wonderful. I felt so excited about being an African-American woman, being able to tell the story of Harriet Tubman. So I felt that I was bearing the culture in many ways. And 2 women producers, one of whom is African-American, 2 writers, both African-American, director, African-American woman, African-American costume designer, African-American production designer, African-American composer, African-American hair and makeup. And I felt that we were bearing the culture of the Harriet Tubman story beautifully.
Charles, you dealt with quite a few real-life people
Indeed,
in Bombshell.
Yeah.
Did you ever get to meet any of them? Did you meet Roger Ailes? And if you didn't, what would you have wanted to ask him?
Did not meet Roger. He died about when I was about halfway through. I did meet quite a few of the others, 12 of whom probably, or 13 of whom have NDAs, so we can't really talk about who they were. I guess I would say that in the case of Roger, I felt like the narrative that the women had told about him was pretty strong. And it had a fascinating consistency throughout it, particularly trying to arrive at his particular kinks, his sexual pathology, maybe too strong a word, but certainly his sexual love map.
We like sexual pathology. It has a ring to it.
Sexually pathological.
It was a strange one, right? Because generally speaking, the female characters were so much easier to write than the males because so many women had raised their hand and in great granular detail said, this is exactly what happened to me, this is how it happened, this is the power dynamic behind it. So I had all that I could borrow on. So obviously the guy who's the perpetrator doesn't raise his hand and say, yeah, I'm the perpetrator. So, so those are much harder stories to tell. But fortunately, Roger had been a subject of a great deal of journalism, very good journalism. And had also a kind of quasi-sanctioned autobiography that was available. It was a subject matter
biography that didn't reveal, I think, all the sexual stuff.
You're talking Gabe Sherman's?
Yeah.
He did a pretty good job though. But it just didn't in terms of some of the underlying Roger's desire to sexualize his power. What he didn't get to is the actual expressions of that, which obviously the women that I talked to.
Can I ask you a question?
Articulate.
It's a really interesting thing that I've been wrestling with and trying to make my way through, and I'd love to know what your guys' opinion about this is. When you're writing a character whose views sort of roughly align with your own, it's much more effortless to work on that character. Then you have to somehow write a character who you have no empathy for, and yet the task, we kind of have to love our characters equally, and it's a bit like to have an even boxing match, they have to be in the same weight division. And the question is, how do you write empathetically for someone who you don't have, any instinct for?
I prefer it. And maybe it's a form of self-hatred, I don't know, but I prefer to write people who I don't agree with. Because I can turn the scene so many more times because I naturally have an instinct to counter their ideas. So I much prefer to write conservatives.
And does it change you? Does it change your view of that person?
I think anytime you write a human being, it does some form of, normalizing is too strong a word, but it does some form of giving you an empathetic relationship to their place in the world. And that is that is so helpful, even for perpetrators of misdeeds.
So when you wrote Jojo Rabbit, what was the toughest part of the writing?
I don't really remember what the toughest part of it was. It was like one of the few times I've written a script where I don't really remember doing it. Usually I would start at the end and then maybe a bit at the beginning and sort of figure it all out that way. This one I just sort of went from beginning all the way through in a linear fashion. But I like writing characters that are desperate to be liked or desperate to be loved or desperate to be accepted or cool, and who are just overcompensating so much that they become acerbic and really kind of like horrible. And I like writing horrible people who aren't necessarily villains, or it's more that they are just trying so hard to have an opinion or trying so hard to be cool. I find them really fun to write.
What was the genesis of that idea?
I think it's just from wanting to be liked, or myself.
About the boy and
the genesis of this film?
Yes.
It's inspired by a book that I read in 2010 called Caging Skies, and then the book is very much a sort of darker piece, and it's about this boy and this girl, and so the bones of it, of the film are within that, which is a boy who's in the youth, discovers his mother is hiding a girl in their attic. And that's really that was my only sort of real thing I took from that. So I don't really know how to make a straight drama. I'm not sure I'm capable of that. I had to add in things that would make it more interesting to myself, and sensibilities that are specific to how I tell stories, which is humour, fantastical elements, little heightened moments, and this imaginary character. And so none of that were in the book. So I had to kind of make it more interesting.
In the book, that's interesting.
No,
when you write, what's the toughest part of writing for you? What do you struggle with?
Writing is an exercise in empathy, so for me, that's always my approach. So I tend to prefer characters that I don't necessarily agree with, and I like making them convince me a little bit. So I don't know what I find the toughest part. Probably just Act 2? I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Like the middle.
Oh, really? Do you start at the beginning and work forward?
No, I jump around too. For Hustlers, I wrote the scene where the two of them meet first. I wrote the scene where Jennifer Lopez's character wraps Constance Wu's character in a fur coat. But
That's a great scene.
It's very much their relationship too.
yeah, I thought that immediate intimacy, especially because you've seen this character, she's grappling with loneliness and isolation and at this new place, and doesn't have physical contact with any of these girls, and has physical contact with men, obviously, and strangers, and I think that kind of intimacy that women have immediately was very exciting to me, to show that that mother-daughter relationship that sort of unfolds.
It's interesting to me that you're partners with another writer, Bo Burnham, who was on this roundtable last year.
Yes.
How have you influenced his work, and how has he influenced yours?
Oh, I don't know. We're pretty separate entities. We do like to read each other's scripts, and he shows me things he's working on. I show him things I'm working on, but I don't know. I mean, it's nice, obviously, to have someone that you trust, that you can
Did he give you
bounce
any
off of.
big note about the script?
No. I showed him a cut, and I would say he gave more notes on like earlier cuts than on the script itself. And
Do you remember one of those notes?
oh gosh, there was more voiceover in the beginning, and it was really people were there's an interview that is part of the framing of the story, but you don't arrive at it right away. So I had this voiceover that led us there, and people were seeing it as two different devices. They were seeing the voiceover and this interview, and I was like, but the voiceover is the interview. So kind of just, pared it down in the beginning and got to the essentials.
Where did you begin with Just Mercy? And you had a very well-known lawyer in that film. What was the most difficult part of writing that script?
I wrote the script. We adapted it from the book Just Mercy, and I wrote it with Andrew Lanham. And we definitely stepped into it with a big weight on our shoulders, a lot of self-doubt as to whether we are the right people to tell this story. What we had that was unusual was a partnership with Bryan Stevenson from day one. I mean, having my first conversation with Bryan and hearing how he connected with the work that I had done and what he thought I could bring to this story was the thing that made me feel like I could do it. He's incredibly gracious and not overbearing at all, but he was a resource from day one all the way through the process. And those, I actually find that if you don't take liberties in adapting something, you honestly are going to be further from the truth, because you're going to have just a sloppy. You just can't fit something into 2 hours unless you're piecing it together. We had Bryan Stevenson, who's an incredible storyteller. I mean, he is a lawyer, but his gift is storytelling, and his gift is empathy. He does it in the courtroom, and that's all he does for his clients. Is he tries to allow a jury or a judge to understand a person in all of their layers. He starts with the stereotype, or he starts with the crime or the criminal, and then he starts pulling off the layers so you understand the full person. And by the end of that understanding, it's so much more difficult to judge. And that's what he was able to do with us throughout the process. And he really helped us fill in those blanks.
What liberties with the truth did you take in the script?
We fortunately did not have to take many liberties because Bryan was really helpful in helping us fill in the gaps. The liberties that we did take were just time. We didn't really create any scenes. We created the dialogue in the scenes, but we didn't have to make up any events. But we did, shift things around to happen in the flow of what we wanted the script to be.
But even documentaries,
That's
shifting
what I was
of,
gonna say. It's a story.
Nothing and I think the varying levels of how respectful you need to be to the truth or to actual events. Cinema is so different, and telling stories and even comes down to just keeping them engaged, keeping people actually interested in these people, because the actual events sometimes take course of 6 or 7 years.
Time compression's a gimme. Time compression. You're going to have to do time compression. That's it. It's just there's no.
You also created a character, though, right?
I did, yeah. Yeah, because there were obviously the one woman you never hear from in those scenarios is the woman who has a quid pro quo sexual relationship with a boss, and. It would be cruel to out someone in that way, but also it's just that's a hard narrative to access, and so it felt important that person not only be a composite, fictional, but we say that, clearly.
You're talking about the Margot Robbie
I am
character. So in fact, was there anybody who came out and said, yes, I did have a sexual relationship with him under pressure?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. But you didn't go with that character.
No.
Why?
The most famous relationship happened prior to the framework of the film. It was also a relationship that began prior to the starting of Fox, and a relationship that carried into Fox, and its status as a relationship that qualifies under the legal term sexual harassment was problematic because it was pre-existent. And so I really wanted to very clear stories that illustrated the dynamic without getting into things that were, I want emotionally complicated scenarios, but not ones that were sort of legally mired. Yeah.
Did you find anything to like about Roger Ailes?
Yeah. Roger's not Harvey. Roger was a man who was genuinely beloved by a lot of people, very much so, and even by lefties. And so he was someone whose capacity for seduction was pretty profound.
By the way, you could say the same about Harvey. He's a man who, when he wants to, could be incredibly charming.
So I never
when
had
he
a
wasn't
good
threatening your life, and I've had him, had both.
Yeah, interesting.
You never had a good experience with him.
No, I didn't have many at all, but I don't know a lot of people who have real love for Harvey. Even 10 years ago, I didn't know a lot of people. I know people who said, "Oh, he leaves me alone. I get to make my movies. I'm happy about that," because he doesn't normally do that for most directors. I've had that conversation, but I've never had. But Roger was capable of a kind of register of paternalism that really appealed to a lot of people, and he was good at what he did, perhaps to the chagrin of those on the left, but he was good at that.
Actor, you always refused to work for Harvey Weinstein. Was it easy to say no? How much do you have the liberty to say no to projects, especially when you're starting?
It was a kind of, I don't know what it is, it's some sort of compass that just said, no danger, Will Robinson, go over here. And it was just my self-defense mechanism kicked in, and I just thought, I don't want to become a victim of what I know he's done with other people. When you hear that someone who's done one film with him then insists on a clause in the contract, a non-screaming contract, that if Harvey screams at you, you get this amount of reimbursement. And I thought, no, I don't. Life is way too short.
Life's too short.
You
for
had
that.
a Harvey screaming clause and stuff, and I thought life is way too short. And you know, I want to work with people I want to have a beer with.
Is the business an easier place to work today, or not?
I think it is.
I haven't worked with a screamer in a long time. You know, but I mean, I know
But you
they're
did?
out there. Well, yeah.
What was your worst experience?
When I was an actor, I worked with somebody who was. I mean, I had a lot of love for him, but he was, you know, just cranky, and you know, I remember after takes, and he yelled at so many people. After take, saying, you know, was that okay? And he said, yeah, it was good. It was fine. I would have yelled at you if it wasn't, you know, that kind of guy, you know. But it certainly wasn't part of my approach, because I did get to, as an actor, work with directors that you know, I could admire, and so I knew what I liked, and so that's what I tried to bring in. But I don't know, is it a gentler business?
I feel like it's. I like to think that it's easier now, because I think now, especially with, you know, the web, and it's so much easier for people just to say things, you know, just to speak out. Where, you know, before Twitter and before people, you know, before it was okay to kind of come out and say, this guy just did this to me, or, you know, or this person just like screamed at me. It was just, you know, it was just like secondhand news. You'd just hear it through conversation, you know, at a bar. And oh, I heard this thing about this, you know. But there's no way to kind of get those stories out there. And I think now people, you know, I've never, thankfully, worked with any actors or anyone who, you know, who've brought so much ego to set, or, you know, brought this attitude to set, which was pretty common, I feel, in like the 80s and the 90s, based on what I've heard and read, because I feel like there's no place for it anymore, and people, they won't stand for it, you know.
But also, on the business side, you know, and maybe the companies I work with, there are women in the room now, you know, and there weren't, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? And that has changed the underlying...
Has the
dynamic.
Me Too movement noticeably changed things, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, people aren't as blatant about it anymore. I mean, I was going to say, I wonder if it's changed for us sitting at this table, because, I mean, recently I was not sitting at tables, and it's not easy when you're not in a position of power. So I don't know anymore. I think once you're in a position of power, you might be facing different people who are treating you differently and talking to you differently.
Since Hustlers, have you noticed that people treat you differently?
Yes, yes. Yeah, my agent came over the other day. She'd never been over before, so yeah, it changes immediately, yeah.
What do you guys think about the current war between the Writers Guild and the agencies?
Well, we all want it to be resolved as quickly as possible. I love my agents. They do a great job for me. When I heard about this conflict, I was blindsided by it. I was very happy with the state of things. And then I found about these issues that were profoundly affecting our colleagues. So I stand with the Writers Guild.
You do, Charles?
I do, but I want a quick resolution.
Yeah, I stand with the Guild too. I mean, I haven't ever made a TV show, so it's a little bit different, I think, for us than it would be for people who come out of television.
Do you all stand with the Writers Guild, or does anybody not?
No, I do. I want a quick resolution too. I'm too stressed out to have to think about stuff like this. I've got too many things happening.
Are you stressed?
Yeah, I mean, you can't see my legs, what they're doing right now. But yeah, I'm stressed out.
I mean, is success stressful?
It depends what success. I mean, having people see your films, that's my sort of...
That's stressful.
That's stressful, but also finishing a film and getting it out there, it's actually like, that's a relief. Like, it's one less thing to have to worry about anymore. So it's just, for me, it's just about meeting, like, whatever deadlines I have, and just handing things in, finishing something and then getting it out of my life as fast as possible that's the stress relief.
And having to go to roundtables and talk about it.
These are the worst.
Destin, you seem very calm. What most stresses you about working in film?
The calmer I seem, the more stressed I am. I mean, I find I actually get very anxious anytime I'm leading up to a project. it feels like I'm going to die. And I tell my wife, don't ever let me do this again. I actually asked her how many times I've said that, and she said, before every movie that you've ever directed, I say that. And I'm so serious about it. But it is like how my wife describes childbirth. As soon as it's over and I've gone through the process with such an amazing team and have built this family, it's the memory of it becomes so beautiful that I'm like, yeah, let's do this again.
Yeah. What about writing? Is that therapeutic or is that stressful?
For me, I find it so psychologically damaging and challenging. But
why?
Because I have so much room for self-doubt. When I'm on set and directing, it's just there's so many people making it together, and you have to move so fast that you don't have time for self-doubt. You just like boom, boom, boom. Oh, that's working. That's not working. And writing, I can write a scene and be like, oh, that sucks, and then go again, and then it's so easy to get in my head.
What about the rest of you? Is writing stressful? Is it?
I find it enjoyable, or maybe it's more that it's just second nature to me by now. I've been doing it since I was a kid. I was writing scripts when I was in like 4th grade. I should say scripts in quotes because they were not that, but attempts at screenplays in like 4th grade. So for me, it's just an all-day, everyday thing. It's lonely. It's definitely lonely, and I now that I love being on set. I never knew what it meant when singers would say, like, I feel so at home on stage. I was like, no, you don't. But it's really now it's a way to get back on set because I think that's, for me anyway, the pure joy of it.
What about you? Do you like writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always found it lonely, but then my favourite thing is actually after people have gone to bed. I don't have to talk to anyone. That's what my favourite time is, to sit there and come up with ideas. The thing really is like, the thing I find the hardest now, just from having so many things that and it's my own fault because I said yes to them, but is just starting with that blank page and just thinking, oh my God, I've got 120 of these to fill up. and it's really, I mean, when I've got a flow going on, it's amazing. I can, and I just won't stop. And but it's more just, and I don't tend to sort of I try not to sit in front of a computer. I try not to just sit there and stare. And I try as much as I can to kind of get all the beats as much, or figure out a sort of loose shape of the story before I start typing.
Name one writer you all admire, or individually. Doesn't have to be a screenwriter. So nobody around this table, but is there one writer who's really influenced you?
I think I would have to say the late, great Toni Morrison, just because she had such a profound effect on my kind of worldview in terms of literature and African-American literature and the way that I approached character.
Anthony?
I wasn't a writer until I sat in on a English literature course at my second year of university by accident. I was keen on a girl and I followed her into this room, sat beside her and asked if I could have a look at her text. So she was the mother of my first child, and the book that she was studying was the Norton Anthology of American Literature post-1945. And I took a copy of this home and started reading it, and it was a real epiphany for me because it said to a working class kid from Taranaki, New Zealand, that you didn't have to be a professor to be a writer. You could write about the domestic, you could write about the banal, but you had to do it with passion and you had to provide some insight. And the accessibility of post-war American literature changed my view of what I felt I was capable of doing.
Yeah, for me it's been different. There were phases of different writers, I've often, in association with a project, will fall in love with.
But name one writer who's really...
Well, like David Foster Wallace had an influence on Big Short. Currently, I rely a lot on Anthony Appiah's work just because of his worldview is so delightful, I think, for this chaotic time.
Destin?
Bradbury was probably where I honestly struggled with writing growing up. I've never considered myself smart enough to write. Bradbury is an intellect like no other, but there's something really accessible about his characters. And to me, my journey as an artist has been just trying to find a place in myself to be myself through what I'm creating, and not try to be something other than that. And my strength, I find, is that I try to be as vulnerable as I can through the writing that I do, and not try to be smarter than I am, because I'm not that smart. But that's where I gravitate towards.
Lorene, what about you?
I grew up like loving plays, so I loved Sam Shepard growing up, and then I loved Anthony Burgess at different times. I loved Tom Robbins is probably who I think of as like my high school, like the writer I was. Yeah, exactly.
Taika?
There are two that I usually go back to. William Faulkner. But when I first was introduced to him, I'd never been to the South. I'd never, had no real idea of that world other than seeing stuff in films, and then just fell into like the way that he wrote, and especially with character, and dialogue, which was something that it just resonated with me, and I've always loved him. And then, I love short stories more than novels. I love them because they're quicker. But also, I just feel like they're often more poetic for me, and sort of Hemingway's shorts. But I'd say Oscar Wilde is probably the guy I'm always going back to. Well, because his wit, he's got such a. Well, no, you wouldn't expect that, but
I'm trying to see the influence and.
You don't need to. It's probably Oscar Wilde's probably got the humour and the wit and the.
I can see it.
And I just love. He's just so like and especially with his short pieces, he's just he's cheeky.
Mm-hmm. We talked about change in the industry. If you could change one thing in the industry, what would it be?
Oh, I mean, wow. It would have to kind of be this question of inclusiveness and parity. I mean, it's just it's so overdue, and other places are doing much better at it than we are. France, for instance, film has to kind of be a time capsule, for who we are now and what we're interested in and what we're thinking about and what we're dreaming about, and it doesn't feel that way yet. I mean, it's beginning to feel that way, and so that's exciting. But I think it's a real tragedy, that for so many years, just the predominance of white men. I mean, love those, a lot of the movies and a lot of the voices are so important, but it's just, it's so out of step with reality.
I mean, to back that up, when our movie was the first movie that Warner Brothers officially did the inclusion rider for, and I was able to see as a director firsthand, I mean, in the same way that the Me Too movement has empowered people to just kind of start doing what they really believe anyway, and it allowed us to hire department heads who were African-American, female, have been doing amazing work for like 30 years and have never been a department head before. And we're giving them their first time being that. That to me is the power of that, and I hope that it happens more.
Do you agree, or would you change something else?
Oh, I mean, I feel like that's most important. I mean, I think that's the biggest step. But the kinds of movie that get made, I mean, I think the financiers are very specific people. I would love to see more diversity in the financier department. I mean, it changed in 2008, really. The financial crisis, at least in my opinion, had such a large effect on even the kinds of movies that were getting made. Cynicism took over around that time. And so in a way, I almost think these superhero films are a response to that cynicism. But money talks. I mean, it is. And you have audiences turning out. People obviously want to see what they want to see. So.
I think we're going to miss Annapurna, for example. Your movie, Booksmart. I mean, they developed some remarkable films.
I know. It's kind of interesting how Meg Nelson has been attacked in the business when actually she's putting her own money in something that was wonderful, I wonder if there's a kind of sexism at play there, or resentment of something.
Absolutely,
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
I mean, she's also young. She's also, coming from money. But I think if she was a man, I don't know that that would have been the same reaction to.
Really?
I do. I mean,
last question. This one I've been dying to ask you. You're on a desert island. You've written about Stephen Hawking, you've written about Churchill, and you've written about the two popes. Which one of all your characters would you most like to be on an island with?
Freddie Mercury. It'd be way more fun than anyone else. He'd shown me something about living passionately. I mean, that guy burned, and for a quiet writer, that's probably the best life lesson for me.
Charles?
Yeah, Steve Eisman from The Big Short would be probably a pretty fun, you know, he would certainly not stop talking, and, you know.
I mean, I was going to say Bryan Stevenson, not because he is a lawyer, but he actually happens to be an incredible jazz musician with an incredible voice, and he actually said that if I asked him if he wasn't doing this work, what would he be doing? And his whole family is really musical, and he said he'd probably be in a jazz band. So,
and he's a good storyteller.
Yeah, it'd be very entertaining.
I mean, I would definitely pick Harriet, but you know, besides being possibly practically handy on a desert island, you know, and just an awesome person, she was a great storyteller. So she, you know, she told her own stories, did these one-woman shows, and told her own stories, and a singer, you know.
Taika, not Hitler, obviously.
I don't know. Thor. Because he's a really fun guy. He's my mate.
I mean, my last movie was about my mother, and no offense to her, but I don't know if that would be healthy.
So much for taking part in Close Up with the Hollywood Reporter writers. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, hi there.
Hi, I'm Casey Lemmons.
I'm Charles Randolph.
Thank you for watching.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching the Hollywood Reporter Roundtable
On YouTube.
On YouTube.